Hello everyone, today we talk on the Banal Lordship, about which I made only one video up to this point. So essentially looking at the development of the spontaneous seigneuries into high medieval Europe that, I've dedicated actually quite a number of videos on Schwerpunkt to the development of high medieval seigneuries. But the banal lordship is extremely important, as the ban, or banality, was originally essentially this power to command men in war, and it evolved over time into the generic also authority, or say unrestrained authority, to order and to punish and to have a greater control over society. And this is a word that appears actually in the 5th century law codes of Germanic origin, but it grew to become something very different. That is, in fact, the banal lordship, as is also the historian Georges Duby actually stressed in French, la seigneurie banale. So to describe essentially this development of the development of a form of lordship not based not merely on the ownership of the land, but on the bannum. So on a private power that it was essentially expanding over these communities with the force of arms, or not necessarily, but however as a spontaneous power, it was undetached by the public authority. So now we're going to look a bit more thoroughly, especially on how this process basically started. Maybe we will dedicate other videos to the banal lordship as, more from a conceptual point of view, because sometimes it's difficult to get it right. What was the real difference at this point between a banal lordship and another form of authority? This is also important, and we will kind of try to explain it now, but not specifically in detail. But just showing how it formed up, which probably helps more in some ways, even rather than strictly defining it. So, as we have seen how the ban, or the bannum, if you prefer in Latin, it was this power of command that was essentially created at ideally to protect the community that was dwelling in a given territory, and the explication of this seigneurial ban had to lead necessarily, and especially how it started happening towards the 10th century, so in post-Carolingian times, mostly where the political fragmentation was higher, to the formation of, let's say, countless spheres of power that were not just military, but also they were also jurisdictional, and also to the very gradual development of certain forms of exploitation that were essentially comforted by the exercise of military power and of the same jurisdiction. So this is very interesting because the political and military power can fluctuate a lot. If you look at history, you can argue that the whole deal of even of warfare and politics is about figuring out the change. It's not actually about having a certain power or an army, and so you're done. Because everything around you is changing continuously. And even within your system, there are changes. So this is how actually history works. By the way, there is the end of history illusion, that is this conception that humans, it's been proven, scientifically speaking, that they have a lot of difficulties to actually foresee how changes will happen. Actually, we tend not to think that change will happen, or at least we radically underestimate our own ability of change. So what is interesting in this is that in the chaos that had followed, the relative chaos that had followed the fall of the Carolingian Empire, These lordships were sometimes so strong at a local level, not only to be enforced politically and militarily, but also to create some forms of jurisdiction that eventually in part were to survive into the following centuries. That is, you organize a territory not just because you have a deterrent power you can extend on it, but also because the same communities that live in this place are actually cooperative in many ways, also in many different ways, to create a form of organization that eventually gets sanctioned as a sort of jurisdiction. And the jurisdiction is extremely important because law is not something you can invent by yourself theoretically. Even the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, in their inherent, political and institutional weakness, because let's be honest about it, they weren't anything extremely strong, and practically almost at least, if not all of them, had this process of decline of the central authority, especially from the original from the original times when the Germans had arrived in arms and were still strong, and even a sort of ethnical component detached from the rest of the population. In a few generations, everything got much more blurred, and this power went progressively to the aristocracies that at this time had basically blended in between the Romans and the Germans. So even for the Carolingian Empire, this is evident that even though the Carolingians had pushed, especially from a certain point onwards, for the reinstatement of a sort of centralized power and public authority, much of the power that was actually enforced into the Carolingian Empire was already largely private-based. So it's as if the Banal lordship as such had always, not really always existed, but there were the premises for it to develop even in post-Carolingian times, as the Carolingian Empire represents this kind of revival of a central authority for this relatively short or long time, depending on how you want to consider it, for essentially falling once again into a pretty, not anarchic, but pretty, let's say, chaotic or situation that had a very few into which a public authority was too absent to respond to the needs of the local communities. So that at that point the public authority had been the only one who could practically enforce the law, to create new laws. This was done in varied ways, actually, because part of the laws at that time were still based on the local traditions, if you want. Especially the Germanic world had seen the idea that the tradition of the people is what made the law, and actually also the Roman law had originally been born like that. I mean, like the tradition of the Roman people then eventually got transformed when naturally society transformed and the empire enlarged, and also the power of the freemen declined, and it transformed itself into a monarchy de facto, and this monarchy, being quite strong into the Roman Empire, was able to enforce laws that in fact were at this point something closer to our essentially to our view of the law, that is something essentially centralized, something that is that is present everywhere, the same place in the same time, and you cannot escape from it, even if you refuse it, as by saying I don't recognize your authority. It doesn't matter, because wherever you are, your state is gonna practically enforce theoretically. This is also pretty relative in the sense that naturally not every state has ever reached a full control over every single person, not even in the most centralized, statalist, totalitarian societies, totalitarian states. This has reached such a measure. So now we could digress powerfully on how on political philosophy, etc. How this is not the point. The point is now, relatively to banal lordship, to see how new laws were created by authorities that de facto were not deputed to that, and that were able eventually to see even those laws, those prerogatives, to be recognized by the same public power. And this is very important because it's at this point in history that basically the Ancien Régime, so as this set of local, of customary laws, essentially, of various origin, because this also was mixed. I mean, let's say, this is the moment into which feudal law, broadly meant, begins. That is essentially that the king theoretically still has the full power over everyone, but not quite so, because in the social contract these local lordships had become too powerful, and sometimes the same king was obliged to recognize their prerogatives, so in turn making it a sort of untouchable right, unless you basically didn't rise against the same king. So this is extremely complicated because throughout the whole Middle Ages and even great part of the modern age, if not all the modern age, there's been this continuous struggle between the central authority, the public authority, how you want to call it, and these private authorities. We said, okay, you do things as long as we are pleased with that. Think about the Magna Carta, for instance, and that was England that up to that point had maintained instead one of the strongest central powers in Europe. England and Sicily were the most centralized feudal states at the time. Then a big crack like the defeat at Bouvines made essentially and the loss eventually of many lands into France, etc., brought to that let's say new balance, for which the English barons now had a much greater bargaining power and were based to impose to the king what is recognized now as as a form of, actually as a positive aspect, as definitely British political culture places a lot of emphasis in this sense on the concept of the agreement, of the coming together of many points of view that in fact represent the various and I think it's beautiful, because actually the common law is really sometimes more effective than the civil law, and vice versa in other occasions, by the way. So it's interesting to see how different models developed at many times in history, because you realize that behind these models there were certain political and social premises that necessarily brought to that. And things also in here could have gone radically in another way. Just think of if the Anglo-Germans had won at Bouvines, the Magna Carta would have not existed, for instance. So this would have changed the whole history of the world. And it's interesting also because at the time these were all kind of feudal powers, so more or less, even despite of course the various societies were quite differentiated, still the situation was pretty homogeneous in terms of degrees of centralization. So sometimes it's even easier to highlight the differences on the base of these different balances. Given this, as we've seen in the previous centuries to the 10th century, to the beginning of the development of feudal Europe proper, the kingdoms that had born with the Germanic conquests into Western Europe had basically created, in the person of the king and of his delegates, the figure of the justiciary, essentially. So this this process had kind of justified, or at least developed, certain forms of exploitation, like the imposition of that were justified as public of needs of public activities, and that were essentially also in here justified through their own explication. Think about fines, think about confiscations, duties, the requests for hospitalities and other donations, and the imposition of military service, the presence of essentially courts of law for trials and all this, for carrying out the justice, indeed, the work performances, especially at the time the local communities were mostly asked for these performances for keeping in shape the route of communication, routes of communication. So at this point, the concept of a central authority had already taken shape in a way or in another. Now, the Germanic societies had always kind of adversed this, because they still lived in the idea that everybody was free theoretically, so nobody could really impose a sovereign authority aside from in certain short amounts of time, or for a delegation, however, that came from the people. We're talking about especially military offices. How this was. However, this was something that could work in a semi-nomadic society like the Germanic one had been in the Barbaricum. Especially the military authority kind of increased, especially during the migration era, because previously to that, Germanic society was also even more egalitarian, because in order to move all these peoples on the march, you have to have a sort of power for organizing the expedition, the movement, etc. And also this kind of varied depending on which population really we're talking about, because there were certain peoples who were much more centralized than others. But when the migration era came to an end, so these populations settled down, especially into the lands of the former Roman Empire, so with a radically different society in there, and they began to get absorbed eventually by the same local society. It was evident that for that world that was already built up, the local world was built up to be governed through infrastructures, to a completely different productive system, etc. The same Germanic kings began to build something greater, something that evidently was inspired by the Roman models, not by Germanic ones. And this, excuse me, I drink a lot. This was definitely of some effect, we can say. Excuse me. Because even though we have seen that these kingdoms began to decline, very often in favor of the local aristocracies, so kind of making it fail the general process of centralization. However, the institution of kingship was present, was functional, was ideally functional, and it was actually a very important form for the same elites that had kind of eroded that power to have a point of reference for, let's say, imposing to the rest of the population their own, even their own same authority. Because if you control the monarchy, you can, in this sense, legitimize even your private ambitions. And this is what happens, in fact, once again after the end of the Carolingian Empire. Public authority was not forgotten, was not erased. It was not pure anarchy. Public powers were still very, very important, even for the same banal lordships, because the the various lords could recognized their new invented prerogatives and jurisdictions, and to essentially by the same king. So making it become not really a public law, but having a public recognition of a private power that is, in this sense, made up the feudal power in itself, that was definitely now becoming even part of the public world in a way, in the sense that even I made a video about this recently that is kind of interesting under this point of view, which explains that even the process of centralization that began to occur into the feudal monarchies from the say from the 11th to the 12th century, depending on how you want to periodize this, actually started from the same feudal law, or at least the same feudal forms in part, that were becoming an hybrid with these formerly public prerogatives. The video is called, it's in Medieval Society playlist, it's called Construction of the New Feudal Monarchies 11th to 12th Century, and it deals with this problem, with this paradox, actually, not even a problem, because at that point the feudal right had become so widespread, and feudal practices were pretty much the average, that even the same monarchies of the high and low Middle Ages were essentially being born through the same in the same fashion that had seen the rise of the Banal Lordship in a way, even though still, albeit still maintaining the ideal hope to manage to be recognized as a sovereign authority because of its own public prerogatives that had gone sensibly weakened over time. So this process of decline, as we've seen in after Carolingian times, that the lord of a fortress, let's say, in order to build it and to keep it efficient, and this was very important in the Carolingian world, it was also issued by the same public authority, that for instance, that this lord would essentially exploit the work of the men living in this in the zone that was protected by the fortress, and that he would end up to impose this work performance as a permanent let's say a permanent equivalent, let's say, of the of such protection. So this means to say this essentially began as a tradition for some reason, because initially maybe it was required to defend the community from the Saxon invasions, but even more often by the same local lords that were essentially not very different from those bands of marauders that began to cross Europe from the 9th to the 10th century, and that this would remain as a sort of permanent condition that the lord, given his increasing power, could basically enforce on the local population. And this was done, it was beginning to be done, and interestingly also recognized by the public authority autonomously. There are many cases of, I don't know, a bishop or a lord, it's anyone actually, who had, I don't know, began to build a fortified fence. Well, it sounds bad. It had built a fortification of some sort. It could be also fence, of course, but fortification is more generic, more let's say proper. And this was forbidden usually, because in the Carolingian times you couldn't really do that, because the public authority would tell you, what are you doing. This is especially if you were a vassal, this is a land that has been given to you by the king, and you were not issued by the king to build up a fortification. Not necessary, at least. So why did you do it? This is not your land. Well, already since the late Carolingian times, this process had already started, but it starts even to get to be recognized by the public authority. And to extend, at a point, public authority was practically helpless to counter it. So this also brought, among the other things, to the proliferation of the fortresses all over Europe during this time. So chiefly not actually for defending yourself from the foreign invaders, but actually for building up fortresses through which you could extend your own power over the surrounding communities that most likely were not very happy of such a thing to happen in the first place. As maybe they were obliged by the situation, because of course it was a continuous warfare going on among these various nobles, and also with the second invasion, the invaders, and so kind of accepted to grant to the lord certain power in order to make him certain resources to make him build the fortress. But the fortress in itself, in fact, when the danger was over, was now by itself a quite powerful bulwark that, being in the hands of the lord, not of the rest of the community, could be used by him to carry out certain policies that were aimed at very different results. So this was not even so easy to distinguish, in the sense that there were so many other factors, like the impoverishment of the middle classes, the general economical contraction, everything that could really happen at a point for which, like famines, stuff like that, it could, or other natural disasters that could bring necessarily the community to entrust the power to someone that had the means already to do something about it, and to help them. So this is very shaded, also because most of these, many of these communities were still relatively autonomous. Also in here, we're talking about the 10th century. You don't have coercive powers at the point you can actually control every single person. Doesn't matter if these guys are peasants. Peasant communities at this time were extremely dynamic, extremely warlike, and sometimes fortresses were also built to defend communities from, peasant raids. This happened actually, and it kept happening for a long time. It's not before the 14th century that basically, and even beyond, depending on which area of Europe you want to take into consideration, that peasants would continue being actually a dangerous active force that could really even subvert the social order in that feudalism had instated. So these exactions that were asked by the lord on the communities was famously known as corvées. This is the French term that at least is used historiographically speaking now. And this kind of exaction is just one type of corvée, because it was in fact of banal nature. That is, were you to impose this corvée? I'm no one, but I still can, because I still have the force to do it. So this and this keeps going on. So it kind of continues to be even a tradition in many ways, that is, as long at least as the Lord is powerful enough to impose that kind of becomes permanent over time, periodically. Some other were less periodical, also because the corvée entailed, in this sense, a political cost. as we've seen now, the peasants were still dangerous. So asking for them too much could have brought them to, to a blind corner, and left no other chance for them but to rebel. So also this was very much calibrated. We don't have to see it just as the bad, evil lord from the Grimm castle that look around saying, "Ha, all these slaves, ha, you're my slaves," and doing something like that. It was extremely much more complex. By the way, the same seigneuries were all one with the same local communities, in the sense that it's as if it was a big company. Much of the resources that were exacted by the lords from the peasants were actually redistributed within the same seigneury in some way, for building, in fact, other fortresses, for repairing the roads, the bridges, to pay the military retinues, to make police, as we will say. So it was really something very synergic sometimes. It was accepted even as a sort of social order. Naturally, this doesn't mean that there weren't people who felt oppressed, etc., because that was always like that. I mean, society at this point was extremely violent, in the sense that you don't have to think of violence just as a physical violence, but just even the idea of, think of working for someone, for this corvée, and not having even the chance to rebel. Because people fall into the illusion sometimes that you can always rebel, no matter what the situation is. Yeah, you can, but if you're gonna be dead, maybe it's not what you want if you make your account. So not always you can pick up arms and subvert this order. So this basically starts also to put you into a condition of psychological inferiority towards the upper classes. And this was pretty much interiorized especially into feudal times, for which peasants were considered, in fact, barely human beings. There was a lot of contempt towards them, not just from the lords, but also from the urban classes. It was an unjust world. It was a world where even justice was essentially carried out for some kind of interest. I mean, it was bargained. It's a bit today, like today, if you think about it, by a certain degree, at least, in the sense that today, of course, we have more, let's say, we have fairer, more equal societies than in the past. But still, you see that there is a difference between what is the law and then what happens in reality. There are many unjust things that are kind of passed because of some problems of bureaucracy, of mistakes, of miscomprehensions, of lack of evidence. So just imagine this multiplied at that time, and therefore think also about the insecurity of saying, how is this going to go? So sometimes it was even better to say, okay, I accept this situation as long as I can even survive, because this was still a very poor world, and it was not easy to be out there. So if you put into account famines that could make collapse the whole agricultural system, so your surplus were exhausted, you had to survive some way. In fact, fortresses at this time were so important because they were used also as warehouses of stock for the reserves of stocks, and the seigneurial reserves played actually a very important role in the economy of also the local communities, and could help definitely also save the same community, because if there was a famine that made the whole situation collapse, the whole community collapse, that lord would have lost a lot of resources as well. So if there was a famine and there were enough reserves stocked in the seigneurial warehouses, this could be redistributed to the peasants, not to make them starve to death or obliging them to go somewhere else. So you understand how this was all connected, actually. So there were actually also other type of corvée that were mostly of agricultural character. I mean, also the other banal corvées were kind of mostly of agricultural character, but the difference between the banal corvées and the other ones was that there were in the seigneurial system certain services, in fact, certain corvées, sorry, that the peasants, the agriculturers, owed to the lord, while working into the seigneurial reserve, which was accepted as a general rule. So this banal lordship is something that affirms itself outside of the same manorial system, of this strictly seigneurial system, and it began to be extended on communities that formally at that point was not directly subjected to the lord. This is arguably the most important point, because just take for the fortress, for instance, for the castle, the Moat and Bailey castle you can find in this time, that this fortress needed for instance, a guard to be guarded, to be you needed patrols and stuff like that, garrisons or wherever you want to call it, and this ended up to be, since I mean through this fortress the surrounding communities were actually also benefiting, because the inherently whoever held that fortress was substantially able to impose its deterrence from there, because it was rooted in the territory. They were difficult to conquer, so as long as even as attackers went away, there were still people inside the fortress that could, immediately from this close position extend their power in the over the surrounding territory, and in case of counterattack they could have simply gone back and stayed there or existed there. So even attacking entailed a freaking lot of resources, many more than defending. So there was an inherent military logic even into this system, for which the lord was able to control the surrounding communities through this deterrence. So this entailed that on the over time, the lord would necessarily impose this at least the costs of the garrison all over the surrounding communities. That could happen in many ways. Either this was directly exacted in form of, this time especially in nature, some natural resources and so on. Either the same communities could participate actively to the garrison. This was also another interesting thing that shows that it was not just an imposition, but these people would join more or less forcefully to defend the castle, because through that castle also their own families would be defended. And this put into motion, this essentially triggered the rise of these exactions as essentially an owed service to the lord, as even a form of local law. Another contribution could happen, especially when the territory was invaded, because the garrison duties could be also requested in times of peace. But in case of invasion, for instance, the local communities could also be called up as a sort of levy that existed into various ways into Europe, and especially as infantry, as the majority of peasants definitely couldn't even afford a horse, at least to fight proficiently on horseback, and therefore these pedites, how they were called in Latin, remember this word, milites were the knights, pedites were the infantry, and non-noble infantry. Because, by the way, the militaries could also dismount and fight as infantry as well. But the differentiation between militaries and palitas is mostly also a kind of social difference, a juridical difference. So these guys were called to eventually provide a support force, and not an indifferent one, really, to the permanent armed force of the local lord. That could be made up either by usually vassals, other vassals that fought as milites, in fact, so as mounted heavy cavalrymen. And other men that were called the masnata or masnada, that is essentially or familia, sometimes it's also called, so the family, because these were the family. This retinue was drawn from the family, that is essentially the serfs that were, or the serfs or demi-serfs actually, that lived within the seigneurial household, and that could be armed actually in various ways. To an extent, to an extreme, they could also be equipped as heavy cavalrymen themselves. There were lots of serfs that paradoxically made a much more fortunate career in the seigneurial ranks than free peasants that, in this sense, were issued only to provide for, as to go to war as infantrymen, and there were instead serfs that, having remained in, having their families remained for generation in faithfully under the lord, eventually rose to positions of prestige and so on. And this was also, by the way, a time to which social mobility still did exist. It's exactly because this very close tie to the lord that certain family, in fact, rose to the same seigneurial status. This happened with the viscounts, for instance. The viscounts were not non-noblemen that were put at the guard of certain castles by their lord. Then eventually, I don't know, this lord died out, or and his lineage died out, or he was killed and his seigneury destroyed. And maybe these viscounts, so guys that were there on behalf of the count, that was the average title in the feudal hierarchy at this point, became de facto, maybe through a banal lordship, lords on their own, and these maybe were of servile origin. So this is very, very interesting. So being a viscount was actually not, viscount eventually became as a sort of feudal title on its own, but originally speaking it was in fact as simply as a viscount. So nothing actually very noble in the first place. And there were many, many families noble families that eventually reached also to great prestige, even arguably also to becoming royalty, that had begun back in the day, or at least many of their ancestors had begun like that. So these military retinues were very, very important in shaping the same banal lordship. First of all, think about even the costs of having a heavy cavalry on your own. You need hay and oat for feeding the horses, and sometimes, and these were exacted by the local, from the local communities, by the lord, and this could happen also for food for the same men. So the fodrum actually remained, especially during the Middle Ages into feudal Europe, the symbol of the what was owed to the overlord, especially for feeding his horses. This was transformed into a tax substantially, but it remained. It was one of the core elements, let's say, one of the most important, if not the most important tax actually well, no, but say among, however, it could really depend, among the feudal services that were traditionally required. And this began, in fact, very, very spontaneously, very, very practically, and then rose to be this kind of more or less homogeneously widespread tax all over feudal Europe, because the needs were actually the same. Even if sometimes these lords were also pretty small. They had very few, like a little castle, but I don't know, maybe they had two or three family, through two or three relatives or family that fought alongside him, and even feeding, how many horses could they have? Really, maybe 4 horses plus other 4 for reserve. So 8 horses are actually pretty costly to maintain. So just thinking about the larger lordships, the larger seigniories, how many resources they needed to field retinues of even of hundreds of mounted cavalrymen, an enormous amount of resources that had to be necessarily collected in some way. This could happen through the fulcrum. In fact, sometimes this could be quite simply raided. So that in turn entailed that the raided community would maybe ask protection to another lord to build fortresses and so on. So this had to be organized through a hierarchical authority, and this is how the whole thing kind of began. And it was so homogeneous in many ways all over Europe because the dynamic was practically always the same. So, as we've said before, this process didn't occur just because of war proper, but sometimes were also certain police service to be requested from the local communities. Naturally, the local communities wanted to be defended, wanted to be protected, so there was always a sort of kind of town watch or something like that was organized. And naturally, by the way, I don't want to say that this thing was born, at least I don't want to give you an impression or that this was born from only in feudal times. These local communities always had some forms of military organization. At this point, the lord could exploit partly the pre-existent militia sometimes, but lords have never really been quite keen on armed people, on armed subjects. So during the feudal times, the process is really increasing the let's say shifting the control of violence from the local militias to the lords, and this was also, as we said before, was convenient in many ways because these lords very often, especially in post-Carolingian Europe, started from lands that were already pretty consistent. They were a military class by excellence, pro excellence, let's say. So they were already about war. These were originally the vassals of the Carolingian kings that had gone to war with their masters every single year, who knew perfectly well the business of warfare and so on. So they already had a great dominion. The local communities might have been armed with a local militia, local garrison, etc., but they weren't professionals. So there were people who had no interest in, participating to this military, providing this military service, because that equated to go away from their fields, from their families. So that was also pretty serious economical damage. So sometimes they themselves were happy to entrust the military organization to someone who actually already knew how to do it, because it's his job since the beginning. So that's the easiest thing. It's also entrusting the organization to a single person, a single institution, is also a way to disperse less energy in practice, to create less attrition. So all was needed was to have enough reserves for the lord, so to exact these forms of revenues, or their equivalent in some ways. They could be either in service, in money, or in other ways, to actually also attract people who wanted to make a living out of that, for instance, joining the seigneurial retinue. So this is how human societies kind of take shape by themselves, in this sense, through sheer pragmatism, and through sheer practice proper, in the sense that, through experience, what's gonna work better. And never think that this, in fact, was just imposed. This process was just imposed by the noblemen. The lords surely imposed their power with violence, with extreme violence, with every kind of vexation, of oppression, etc. But there was definitely a substantial component that was essentially provided by the same local communities, who recognized that was still the best option given the current conditions to even survive, given the odds. So the police service entailed, among the other things, also the presence of dealing it entailed of dealing with the criminals. So this brought over time also this brought the lords also to carry out those legal procedures that were needed to at least cope with crimes, and that were sometimes asked by the same communities also in here. You could go, just imagine it, you know a powerful guy, you're a peasant, you know that your neighbor's done something wrong. You know that something wrong is something detrimental also to the social order. You know what this is gonna mean. So what do? You automatically go to the more powerful guy, that is the lord, to say, oh look, that guy did this wrong thing, can you please intervene? So it's through these accusations that eventually the lords began to deal also with legal problems. So even sentencing and creating local tribunals and so on, the so-called placita in Latin, this is plural, placitum is a singular, that actually takes its name from the placet, which means it's appreciated, it's liked by the local lord. That is, it's liked that such thing should happen, like in a sentence, that this stresses the consent of the lord to apply certain measures. So at this point, the lords also cooperate, because, as we've said, public authority had not vanished in the air, and the kingdoms at this point had a great deal of emphasis also on their king's ability of dispensing justice. Justice was extremely important in the Middle Ages from an ideological point of view, but if you look at it, it was very important also because the prerogatives of the juridical prerogatives were also attached with forms of revenues. So that if you judge certain cases, you had by law the right to get a certain percentage on the fines, for instance, or parts of the confiscated goods. So justice brought with itself a big deal of revenues, and it was a way, in fact, to control the same society. So the lords began to cooperate, even with the delegates of public power. So to say, this happened actually pretty often, that there was a public official sent by the king that was sentencing together with the local lord a case that happened to that district. That maybe because maybe the local lord was also, by the way, a vassal of the king at the same time. So the lords began to be surrounded also by experts of law to judge different cases of civil nature, like could be, I don't know, the rights of the people or patrimonial controversies. So not just crimes, the most serious crimes, because objectively, even this civil questions required some sort of authority to enforce, the sentences. So most of the times, this power derived only from the banal power, and it was the most immediate, the one that could intervene more directly. So that's why it also was accepted as such, because people wanted justice. So as we've said, fines, confiscations, lodging or housing rights for the seigneurial agents, let's say, and of the lawyers that were working into these trials, were owed to the lords, naturally, and to their local apparatus of power. The lords had also this extreme, perhaps the most important duty that was felt the lord to have towards the local communities was to protect the bridges, the roads, the markets, and that were at this point in fact asked to be controlled by the seigneurial retinues, and which progressively, given the imminent commercial nature of these infrastructures and activities, began to exact certain duties and tolls, and in other similar indirect taxation of public origin, and at the same time kind of even creating new ones. This was very important because exacting tolls was, especially on the roads, etc., was something primarily pertinent to public authority. So these local lords were even usurping the public prerogatives through their banal power, and even creating new taxes. Also, because at this time the same lords took the initiative quite they began to build by themselves things like bridges, roads, etc., because that was very convenient for themselves as well, because creating that was felt as if that bridge, that road, etc., or other infrastructures like even mills, or belonged at that point to the lord. So this basically meant that everybody who wanted to use them had to pay money to them. So if you that was a very intelligent thing to do, because if you built such an infrastructure, you could definitely augment the production, the local production. So making the same local communities growing richer, but at the same time taking a bit of it, some money that could, in this sense, back your own your own power to fill your pockets and to invest, and by investing into this fashion you could become richer and therefore more powerful. There is an example of this that is very interesting, that is you can find from a letter of Knut the Great, so king of Denmark, of Norway, and of England, when in his pilgrimage from England to Rome in 1027, that's where he went in the occasion for the Roman crowning of the Emperor Conrad II. He exposed to the princes that were present at that point the complaints of the pilgrims and of the merchants in England. His subjects of the in the kingdom of Wessex. And we can read it, maybe. This is a letter. Let's see. Because the letter is now Canute, king of all England and of Denmark, Norway, and part of Sweden, to Athenold, metropolitan, and Elric, archbishop of York. This was directly to the English people, and to the bishops and prelates, and to the whole nation of the English, both the nobles and the commons, greeting. So here it deals with other problems, but this is maybe the part, the most interesting part. So be it known, first of all, if you want to look this, you can find it on the internet actually. This was really the letter sent from Rome to the English bishops. So referring to the complaints of the subjects of Wessex, and I'm reading it from actually a site here that is quoting Canute Epistola cited in Florence of Worcester Chronicle, translated by T. Forrester, London, 1854, pages 137-139. But you can find this also in Wilhelmi Malbesbiriensis Monachi, De Gestis Regum Anglorum, Libri Quinque, by W. Stubbs, Volume 1, London, 1987, page 122. That is present in the Rerum Britannicarum Medievi Scriptores 90. So here, basically, the king was stunned at thinking of the more compact structure he was usually he was used in his domination, and in front of, say, this greater mass of local exactions into that he was acknowledging, essentially. So in this paragraph he says, be it known to all of you that at the celebration of Easter a great assembly of nobles was present with our Lord the Pope John and Conrad the Emperor. That is to say, all the princes of the nations from Mount Garganus to the neighboring sea. All these received me with honor and presented me with magnificent gifts, but more especially I was honored by the Emperor with various gifts and valuable presents, both in gold and silver vessels, and in palls and very costly robes. I spoke with the emperor himself, and the Lord Pope, and the princes who were there, in regard to the wants of my people, English as well as Danes, that there should be granted to them more equal justice and greater security in their journeys to Rome, and that they should not be hindered by so many barriers on the road, nor harassed by unjust tolls. The emperor assented to my demands, as well as King Rodolph, in whose dominions these barriers chiefly stand. And all the princes made edicts that my people, the merchants as well as those who go to pay their devotions, shall pass to and fro in their journeys to Rome in peace, and under the security of just laws, free from all molestation by the guards of barriers or the receivers of tolls. I made further complaint to my lord the Pope, and expressed my high displeasure that my archbishops are sorely aggrieved by the demand of immense sums of money when, according to custom, they resort to the apostolical see to obtain the pallium, and it is decreed that it should no longer be done. Okay. So in here you understand how essentially there were also on what a scale this actually was happening, because there were quite international exchanges, as you understood from this letter, and that they necessarily had to flow without many problems. So if this was a great problem in many countries historically, that as long as this kind of seigneurial system remained in place also for a very long time, telling the truth, also in the modern age, everything was also the great international trade and communications were excuse me, hindered by such tolls that had formed back in the day when the seigneurial, the Banal power had begun to emerge. So this has, because it's as if all the goods that passed through these lands were progressively worn out by all the tolls that were set arbitrarily everywhere, and to make essentially the lords making a living out of such incomes. So coming back to the point, what else can we say this here? So as we were saying before, there were also other initiatives that the lords took in their lands that also contributed instead to the economical growth, and this is also to be remembered when dealing with this point. That is basically that had definitely an economical interest also for the local population, generally speaking, and that is the building of things like mills, ovens, oil mills. So the point was, though, that the peasants of the protected community had to essentially mandatorily to use these infrastructures, so that they couldn't build, let's say, a mill on their own. So this also partly hampered the local economical growth, and this meant that these communities were forced to use the seigneurial infrastructures and to pay them further taxes for it. So they had to work on it, but they had for doing that they had to pay to the lord. So over time, and this is why I quoted before that video I made on the development of the new feudal monarchies, with an increase in centralization of the local powers, and also the development of the same seigneuries that now were progressively also expanding through the say through even the structuration of their dominions, there was let's say the fluidification of such dynamics in part, as between the 11th and 12th century, the exaction of in the exaction of really true direct taxation starts having place. So these taxations were initially extraordinary, and eventually they became, through use, increasingly more functional. More regular, and they took a general denomination that, so it was what was owed really to the lord. Initially, this started with natural goods that were paid, also because the economy was mostly agricultural. Trade was did exist, but it was also, the barter was pretty the most common form of payment. Then eventually this was actually quickly standardized into money, because especially with the revival of the European economy, and especially in certain regions, coins started to flow once again. So thus we can say that the yearly the system of yearly of annual impositions that had basically entered into crisis at the beginning of the early Middle Ages was regenerated into the 12th, so that certain means, certain institutions, let's say, that had disappeared into the times of greater centralization of the Romano-Germanic powers, started also in continuity with the effect of the late antique economy, international trade, and so on, started to reappear, in fact, around the 12th century. So when, in fact, trade and economy started to rocket, at least for those times standards, it was naturally a very progressive thing. And so this was evident at the same seigneurial level. And for instance, this was done also by other entities that were forming at the time. For instance, into Italy, it was the communal cities that began to impose to all the people who resided into into the city district, so also in the countryside, a direct taxation that was even called in this term fodrum rusticale, which is interesting because it stresses, you see, the fodrum. This was conceived chiefly even in lands like the Italian ones, where feudalism had not really entered into crisis as such, but with the rise of the cities had kind of evolved and there were also commoners. It was an idea that there was the fodrum, so that was the most important name you could define a tax with, because that was still the one conceived as the most important, and rusticale, so that it pertains to the rustics, to the inhabitants of the countryside. So this was very important, especially from a city perspective, because it really gives you the dimension of how this city was just like a lordship, expanding its control over the peasants, over the actual means of production of the time in the surrounding territory. And the cities were expanding in that sense towards that direction, also containing the control of the territory of the countryside to the rural lords that had started from there, that in part had instead now migrated into the city and started a business there. But even most of the times it actually was really the same the lords that the nobles that existed in the city had also very wide estates into the countryside, and they kind of made back and forth with castles and house towers inside the cities, and I mean castles in the countryside and house towers within the city walls. So having this seigneury that extended even within the city, and certain quarters of it. And this is very interesting because this started happening in moments in the Italian cities, in moments when the other the into which the royal power in the greatest part of Europe were still very pretty much backwards in this sense, for which it was still empirically pushing for these early medieval traditions within the limits that had been imposed by its own weakness, and the development of local powers all around in these smaller seigneuries. So in a moment in short into which the feudal kingdoms of Europe were, rather than stressing this concept of public power, really developing their own power on the same seigneurial base. Like most of these kings at the time were powerful because they had, just like the lords, local resources. Kings and princes had, they owned lands and castles, so that they had essentially a power that was not based on a public prerogative that, as we've seen, was very weak, but on the private assets. And this will remain also in many, can argue in medieval Europe, pretty much the standard here. That the degree of centralization that still existed at the beginning of the early Middle Ages was basically never recovered, or at least in proportion to the private power was never recovered, because it, while in absolute terms naturally the administrative structures kind of evolved much from the early medieval times, but because in the High Middle Ages the development of private powers had basically been out of control. So up to the 19th century, basically the state was not able to take off until the very last prerogative from the local communities and monopolize everything into the hands of the state. This is very important because it tells you that also certain projects of political centralization kind of failed because of this. For instance, the case of Germany is very meaningful because the Germans at one point, the Swabian dynasty of the Hohenstaufen, at one point tried to create into Germany something like a national monarchy on the model of France and England. So with all its relative degree of centralization, France and England were different, to tell the truth, but however, the idea was creating a kind of dynasty that could rule over Germany, and also from here you understand it was a dynasty, because the public prerogatives still existed, but the problem is that they were empty if they were not fueled by a dynasty that was already privately rich on their own. Think about the Ottonians, for instance. Think of the same Swabians. These were dynasties that were powerful because they had lots of private estates on their own, of fortresses, of they had built with their own resources, and that's why they had managed to participate eventually to the feudal, to the German monarchy, and to the imperial dignity, because they had a private asset that could bring them there. So at the time of Frederick II, you realize that the Hohenstaufen give up even trying to create a national monarchy into Germany, and really using their public power actually to back their own private policies, to expand into territories that were now, I don't know, like in Austria where the Babenberg dynasty was extinguished, and therefore expanding their own power as kings, not in fact publicly, but with the same base of with the same rules of feudal right. And this will practically go on. In the case of Germany, it's particularly evident. I made a video that is called, in particular, Princely Germany, I think, that deals exactly with this process of privatization of power. This is, what was the title? Princely Germany, yes, 14th, 15th centuries. That shows you exactly this. That is essentially the idea that a power at this point could rise in Germany, not through the public rights that were now exhausted practically, and had been usurped, and the central authority didn't have any power to recover, but through, in fact, the private power that instead existed. And in fact, if you look at it, this happened similarly into Italy, actually. Italy and Germany have this kind of, albeit very different, they have kind of similarity, because paradoxically, and especially in Italy, I must say, the political fragmentation did not lead on the long run to a further fragmentation. On the contrary, there were certain powers that eventually managed to emerge as kind of a regional powers. And into Germany and Italy, you find this quite clearly. There were either princely dynasties or city republics that managed to extend their power eventually on a regional or a provincial scale, and kind of starting from there to build something greater. Whereas other countries like England, France, and I don't know, the Iberian monarchies had quite of a different shape. Also in here it depends, because if you take Castile, that was a much more dynastic power, and in this sense was more centralized, paradoxically, because everything was, the local dynasty was more powerful. For instance, in Aragon it wasn't like that. In Aragon there were many parliaments, many communities, and the central powers was weaker. Crowns like the one of Hungary or Bohemia or Poland, those were elective instead. So these were actually unitary, at least it depends. I think Hungary was particularly the most unitary kingdom. Also Bohemia didn't kid really. Poland took a bit more, but they were still, say, based, however, they had their power balanced on the will of the local nobility. Arguably France and England were the countries that stressed the most the concept of a central power, and the Kingdom of Sicily, definitely. Actually, the Kingdom of Sicily was the most centralized of the world Middle Ages in feudal Europe, and we will talk about that maybe on another occasion. So for now, I want to quit this video because I think I said everything I wanted, and I don't know. I hoped maybe we didn't talk about. Well, yeah, I think we talked enough about Banal, Lordship as such, but it is something we have to look a bit more in detail, maybe, because it's really more important than it seems, under many points of view. I will try to be also more a bit more of let's say more punctual, especially in what it concerns the definition of banal lordship, how we define it. However, this is not important for now. I just hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.